Okay, take two, because people at the door interrupted me. But anyway, so this video is going to be a challenge, a duel, if you like, for SciMan Dan. Now, SciMan Dan lives in the UK, as I do. So in theory, you know, he could choose his weapon, rapiers or pistols at dawn. But I think that would be a bad idea, mostly because I used to compete at an international level in fencing, and I grew up with handguns. So SciMan Dan would have a tough time beating me in a duel of that nature. But more importantly, I'm really not a morning person, so I don't want to get up at dawn. And lastly, I think SciMan Dan is a cool guy. He's a very intelligent man. He's got a sense of humor that I really love. It's very, very British, or I'd say English even. And I quite like his videos. I've only seen a few of them, but he's a nice guy. I like him. But he made a tragic mistake of touching on a subject that's close to my heart, Mars. And you know, I'm not clever like he is. You know, in this duel, I'm definitely taking the humble route, because he's clever in his videos. He does a lot of switching and, you know, editing and whatever. I don't know how to do that. I'm doing this on my phone on a tripod. So that's SciMan Dan, and that's the video that sparked all this off. Now I apologize, Dan, for, you know, taking a frozen image of you that's perhaps not the most flattering, but all my videos have got frozen images that make me look like a complete idiot. So you know, nor it wasn't intentional. You'll notice the title of the video there is A Conspiracy Theorist's Guide to Mars. Now, to be fair, in this video, he pretty much takes apart a guy who's showing pictures of Mars and say, that's rubble of an ancient civilization. And it's kind of a bunch of rocks, you know. So I'm not having a go at Dan for this particular video at all. But I do want to issue a challenge out there, Dan, and that is, it's gonna sound crazy now when I tell you, but bear with me. I'm not a weirdo, crazy tinfoil hat guy. I actually know what the hell I'm talking about. So, but I'm just gonna put it out there. Two things about Mars. It used to have intelligent life on it, or human type people living on it, and it was destroyed intelligently. Now, I use the words human and intelligent in very loosest sense. So anything from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens and everything in between, I consider human. For the purposes of this video, let's just say those are humans. And when I say it was destroyed intelligently, of course, I don't believe that destroying a whole planet is very intelligent, but I believe that's what happened. I don't believe this because it came to me in a dream, or I channeled it, or the spirits told me. No, there is geological and astronomical evidence that proves this pretty much, I'd say, quite conclusively. So, without further ado, Dan, because, you know, you understand science, you understand astronomy, you understand physics, I generally expect that I don't have to walk you through all the details of every little bit. So I've got a list here split into three parts. So the first part is that Mars could support life, and I'll cover that. The second sort of part or continuation of that is what evidence do I have that life that could support was intelligent or human type life. And then part three, the fact that Mars got destroyed by intelligent action rather than random events. And then I've got a sort of a part four, which is more circumstantial evidence, which I just tack on to the end. But here we go then. So all of this started more than 23 years ago now when I wrote this. And this is the latest version. You know, this is the original, older version. This one's got pictures in it. This one doesn't have pictures in it, but the pictures are on the website. You can go to my blog and see all the images much better on a computer than you can in a book print. And the original NASA images and so on. So in that book, which I wrote 23 years ago now, I made certain assumptions on certain things, because if you're going to have life on Mars, you need at least at a minimum three things. You need an oxygen-rich atmosphere, which has, you know, on our planet it's about 21% oxygen, 98% nitrogen, and about 1% of, you know, random rare gases and so on. You need to have you know, probably you don't have to have 21% oxygen. You can probably get away with something like 10% oxygen for humans to live on it. And you can probably go all the way up to, I don't know, 30% oxygen or something like that, although that might be dangerous if you try and light a match, I'm not sure. But what I'm saying is the range, there's a range there, you know, it doesn't have to be exact, 21 or 20% oxygen. It's somewhere near that ballpark will be enough. And we know Mars had oxygen. How do we know? Because it's kind of red. And SciManDan Dan himself knows this, he mentioned it in his video. The reddish tint of the planet is due to oxidization, which happened when they previously, what I believe was the existing atmosphere, and certainly what was the existing water, got disassociated. The oxygen becomes very reactive and oxidizes pretty much everything it finds, and that's why you get that rust sort of colored look. So there's pretty solid evidence that Mars at one point probably had a decent enough, oxygen-rich enough atmosphere to support life. More importantly, perhaps even than that, is that we have a huge amount of evidence that Mars used to have flowing water. So it wasn't water in the form of ice, and it wasn't just water in the form of clouds and so on. Mars had an ocean. The northern hemisphere of Mars was an ocean. And again, we know this because there are evidence of huge floodplains on Mars that are at least an order of magnitude, and sometimes more, than the largest evidence we have, geological or otherwise, of any flood, including the tsunamis that killed, you know, hundreds of thousands of people. Mars has had floods or tsunamis, call them what you want, these huge catastrophic flooding events that are an order of magnitude larger than anything we've ever had on Earth. Considering that Mars is roughly, you know, about half the size of Earth, very rough measurements, right? That's pretty impressive. And that didn't happen because of wind, okay? That happened because of asteroid impacts, which is what destroyed Mars. But those asteroid impacts didn't happen naturally, and I'll come to that in a minute. Let's just stick with Mars had to have certain things to support life for now, right? So the first is it had to have an oxygen-rich atmosphere, which I believe there's enough evidence to support it used to have. It had flowing water, it had a northern ocean, and then we'll get to how I know there's definitely a northern ocean as well. I mean, it's pretty much accepted, I think, in the astronomical community. It had flowing rivers, and again, you know, you don't have to take my word for it. Go on the website, look at the pictures. This is in the old book. There's an image of one of the flood rivers that are on Mars. You know, there's no difference between a dry riverbed on Earth and this, other than this one's got a little crater on it, so you know it's sort of not on Earth, probably. Now, it also had a magnetosphere. I didn't know that when I wrote this book, but I posited in it that if I'm correct about my theory, then Mars must have a magnetosphere, must have had one at some point. And I found out only after I wrote the book, and very around the same time, pretty much, just after or just before, the scientists had discovered that yes, NASA work, satellites that landed and whatever, basically proved that Mars did used to have a magnetosphere, which was quite interesting to me because I didn't know that when I first wrote it, but so it tends to support the theory. Now, how did it lose its magnetosphere? How did it lose its oxygen-rich atmosphere? How did it lose its oceans? It got hit by asteroids, a bunch of them. And you know, if you hammer a magnet, it loses its magnetism. So that's why the magnetosphere is gone. Also, Mars pretty much almost got cracked open like an egg, you know. But these asteroid impacts, they were not natural. And this is where I show you that I'm not crazy and I didn't channel this. The asteroid impacts on Mars have a certain pattern. The smaller asteroid impacts are older, the slightly bigger ones are younger, and the really big ones that finish the planet off are the most recent asteroid impacts that have occurred. Now, we can tell this because it's relative, right? So the little asteroid impacts get covered over by the slightly bigger ones, or in other words, you can see smaller impacts that are, you know, half buried under the edge of bigger impacts. And then you've got the Hellas Basin and the Argyll Planitia, which are, you know, two huge craters formed by two huge impacts of asteroids that weren't broken up in the atmosphere and hit the planet. Hellas Basin is a crater that's 1,600 kilometers in diameter. It's roughly the size of South Africa, you know. It's a big hit, and consider that Mars is only a little bit more than half the size of Earth, pretty much. Argyll Planitia is another impact crater, 900 kilometers in diameter. So those two impacts finished the planet off. But there were smaller impacts that happened before that. The thing is that all of these impacts, the small ones, the medium ones, and the two big ones, all happen in a very short period of time. How do I know that? Because asteroid impacts are relative, right? You could say, yeah, well, so what? You know, Mars might have had all that stuff. It might have had an atmosphere, it might have had flowing water, it might have had an ocean, but over time, as it got hit by random impacts and eventually got hit by a big asteroid or two, it died. Yeah, well, it didn't happen by chance. I expect Dan to know this, so I'm not saying this for him necessarily, but you know, asteroid clouds are not like in Star Wars. You don't get a bunch of asteroids all floating right next to each other. That's just not how it works. There's thousands of kilometers between them at the best of times, if not hundreds of thousands of kilometers. So, and they all hit Mars pretty much around the same time. How do I know this? Because the southern hemisphere of Mars has from 10 to 100 times the number of impacts than the northern hemisphere of Mars. So why would that be? Well, two reasons. One, if you have an ocean in the northern hemisphere, anything that lands in the ocean that's not really huge isn't going to leave as much of a trace as anything that lands on the southern hemisphere where you've got landmass. Furthermore, the impacts in the ocean would create floodplains, and therefore the actual crater in the ocean would be pretty much wiped out as it happened. But there's another reason. Because if these asteroids are being flung onto the planet intelligently, or because of a war, where are you going to throw those asteroids? You're not going to throw them in the ocean where nobody lives. You're going to throw them on the landmass where the people live, because that's what you're trying to destroy. And if you're on a planet that's being bombarded by asteroids, what are you going to do? You're going to try and shoot those asteroids and break them up so they burn up in the atmosphere, or shoot them up even much further away if possible so they miss the planet entirely. So I know it sounds really like science fiction, but bear with me, we're allowed to think crazy thoughts for a moment, all right? And then you can shoot them down. That's why I'm making this video. Dan, try and shoot down every one of my points, all right? The thing is, if you have anti-gravity technology, and I'll come to that, I've done a couple of videos on anti-gravity as well, so just ignore it for a moment. Let's just pretend anti-gravity technology exists, and it does exist, by the way, but we'll get to that. That's another video, right? Let's say you have machines that can create gravity fields both externally and internally, so they can move around without the people inside getting squished on the walls like jam, and they can create gravity fields outside which pull the ship in whichever direction at fast speeds. If you can do that, you can also create gravity fields to change the direction of these asteroids. And you can make these asteroids go and hit a planet that you're at war with. If you're a defender and you have similar sort of technology, what would you do? You would send your ships up to try and shoot down the other guy's ships, and any asteroids that are coming your way, you try and bombard them, hit them, shoot them with missiles, use other asteroids to hit the asteroids so they break up into smaller chunks that hopefully burn up before they land. But if this war goes on for long enough, the guys planet side are going to lose, because all it takes is for a few of these things to get through and they cause a hell of a lot of damage. And if one or two big ones get through, that's it, you're done. And that's precisely the pattern we have on Mars. That's exactly what we have on Mars. We have smaller asteroid bits hitting the planet first, mostly on the southern hemisphere. Then we have a couple of medium-sized ones, and then we have these two big ones that kill everything off. And that's, to me, that's what happened in terms of why Mars is how it is now, and it doesn't have an ocean, it doesn't have flowing rivers, and it doesn't have an atmosphere even really now, and it doesn't have a magnetosphere. So once you knock out the magnetosphere, the cosmic rays can come in, disassociate the water molecules, disassociate the atmosphere, you boil it off into space pretty much, and whatever's left gets oxidized into the soil and dirt and other stuff. But the thing is, I'm saying that it had intelligent life. Well, what evidence of this do I have? That's it. That's pretty much the title of the book, The Face on Mars, right? There's a huge face there. There's pyramids next to it. There's what's called a fort next to it. And again, you're saying, oh, well, they just look like pyramids. No, they're pretty much pyramids. The guys who first discovered it, Di Pietro and Molinar, in '76, they wrote a book about this, and they did some image analysis of the face and of the nearby objects, and they came to the conclusion that it could be artificial. In fact, when I started writing this book 23 years ago, I was writing a fiction book. I didn't believe the face on Mars was artificial. I thought it was just a bunch of rocks that look a bit like a face. But I was writing a fiction book where it was going to be artificial for the drama of the fiction book. And in writing the fiction book, I did a lot of research, and I realized, oh, wait a minute, there's not fiction. I'm actually writing non-fiction now. And so I started again, and I did non-fiction, and that's what that book is. After, a guy that's done a lot of research on this is Mark Carlotto. Now look him up if you don't know who he is. I've met Mark Carlotto a couple of times. Mark Carlotto is a scientist of impeccable pedigree. The guy is a true scientist. And when I first met him, talking about the face on Mars, he had done work on it that showed to over 98% probability that it was artificial. Now you're saying, well, what work is that? Well, let me tell you a little bit about Mark. Mark is a guy who invented software programs to analyze satellite images to find non-fractal objects. He did this for the military. And they used the software to find camouflaged tanks, camouflaged bases, camouflaged anything pretty much. Because what this program does is it scans the satellite image and looks for non-fractal images. And that's because anything natural pretty much always has a fractal pattern. Anything artificial generally has a non-fractal pattern. And these programs were used by the military very successfully. And Mark used the same program, and he put it on Mars and Cydonia. And now the thing is that when you put this program on Mars, it pretty much looks at the surrounding areas and sees everything normal and natural. When it goes over the Cydonia regions, the pyramids, the face, and the fortress type thing, they all light up like flares. And that's not the only work he's done on it. He's done other work. Now, you've got to understand that, again, Mark is a superlative scientist, in my opinion. And I don't say that easily. He was responsible for inventing a way to save data on crystals. And he did this, I think, over 30 years ago now. And it just sort of disappeared. The military took it and it was gone. So the guy has done some pretty serious work. But again, if you don't believe me, if you think NASA's telling you the truth, get another book called the McDaniel Report, written by Professor McDaniel, who's a professor of science, and he's put this report together again over 20 years ago, which documents, without any shadow of a doubt, all the lies that NASA has come up with respect to the face and other things as well. Even people like Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan was a proponent that if you have stuff like anti-gravity technology, if there is an advanced way to travel between stars, the probability would be that we may find ancient artifacts on our satellites or other bodies of the solar system. And that's precisely what we found. He did a very sharp turnaround, had a very successful career by following the party line. So anyway, I think there was intelligent life on Mars for two reasons. One, the face, the pyramids and so on. Two, the way Mars was destroyed. And there's another further piece of evidence, which is, I've mentioned a few points about why Mars was destroyed intelligently. The asteroid impacts that destroyed Mars happened in a very short period of time. If they hadn't, you would have a pretty much even distribution of asteroids between the southern hemisphere and the northern, where the ocean was. You don't have that, which means they happen in a relatively short period of time. Maybe days, maybe months, maybe a couple of years, but that's what you're looking at. You're not looking at thousands, you're not looking at millennia, right? Statistically, it's not going to be possible for a planet to be bombarded, an order or two of magnitudes more on one side than on another. It just doesn't make any sense. But there's more than that. Mars still has two unspent bullets floating around it, Phobos and Deimos. Phobos is at the limit of, if I remember right from memory, I think it's called the Roche limit, which is the limit at which a satellite gets broken up into its constituent parts by the parent body because it's just getting too close to it. I mean, it spins around Mars in, I don't want to lie to you, see if I find the table in here, but I think it's 7 hours or 9 hours, something like that. And it spins around it on in a very interesting way. So if you take the Earth and the Earth, you know, if this is the Earth and this is the Moon, not to scale, the Earth is spinning this way, the Moon is spinning in the same direction around the planet that the Earth is spinning, which, if they were formed together, if they have some kind of symbiotic relationship, makes sense. That's not the case with Phobos and Mars. Mars is spinning this way, and Phobos is spinning sort of counter to Mars' rotation at the limit of its just about to crash land on the planet. It's that close. There's images of Mars that have been taken that show you the shadow of Phobos on the surface of Mars, you know. So it's a pretty interesting object. And another thing is that it's in a circular polar orbit, I mean a circular equatorial orbit. Again, if it was a captured asteroid, it would have an elliptical orbit. And I don't have to explain this to SciMan Dan too much. I've said what I'm going to say on it. You know, a captured asteroid that ends up in a circular equatorial orbit is very unlikely. But you know what? It might happen, right? Might happen. It's a big universe. It's, you know, a bunch of asteroids were in the area. Maybe one asteroid bump another asteroid just right so that it ends up in a circular equatorial orbit. That could happen once. The fact that it happens on this particular planet, which already has so many other coincidences, you know, tends to make it less likely. But how about it happening twice? Because Deimos is also in a circular, pretty much, equatorial orbit. And it's at the limit of where it's just going to fly off into space, because they're pretty small objects. So, to me, these are unspent bullets. These are asteroids that were going to get thrown at Mars and didn't quite make it, didn't quite land, or the survivors on Mars shot at it enough that they knocked them out of the impact orbit. The interesting thing is that Phobos does seem to have a huge crater right on its nose with striations that they haven't quite figured out what, you know, why there is these sort of cracks or striations that run along the thing of the planet. So those are pretty much my reasons. And then, you know, the last part, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. Now, the things that I've said up to now, Dan, I'd appreciate it if you I'll go through them all, and I'll just, for the sake of completeness, I'll just read through a very quick list. So Mars had a northern ocean, it had flowing water, it had an oxygen-rich atmosphere, it had a magnetosphere, so it could support life. That's what I'm saying. The reason it had intelligent life is because there are still buildings on it that seem to be buildings by all means that we can find, and because the planet's destruction seems to have been created by intelligent means, which is bombardment with asteroids, and eventually two got through Hellas Basin and Argyll Planitia. As you know, Dan, Hellas Basin is, let me just see if I've got one of those images here, because it might just help explain this quickly. I don't know if yeah, this is not going to come out on video very well, but it's a very yeah, you're not going to be able to see that. I don't think. That's a very rough map of Mars. That's the Hellas impact crater. The Tharsis bulge is over here, which is on the opposite side of the planet, and you've got Valles Marineris. That's a 4,000 kilometer crack running through the shell of the planet, pretty much. So, you know, on the opposite side to the Hellas Basin, where it got hit, on the opposite side of the planet, you've got a bulge that's 9 kilometers in high with 3 shield volcanoes on top of it that reach the limit of what any sort of mountain or volcano can reach before it starts to collapse on its own weight. And you've got Olympus Mons, which is, I believe, the biggest volcano or mountain in the solar system. It's like 27 kilometers or miles high, I don't remember right now. So it got hit here, bulged out there, and cracked open. You know, Valles Marineris is not a canyon that was formed by a river. It's a 7 kilometer to 11 kilometer deep crack in the tectonic plate of the planet. No wonder it lost its magnetosphere. So those are the ways I'm saying it got destroyed, and they, all Phobos and Deimos being unspent bullets and so on. Now, there is also a lot of circumstantial evidence. In pretty much every culture on Earth, we have this mythology of the gods coming down from the sky in special machines and sort of running around and still kicking each other's ass, fighting with each other, and using humans as kind of puppets. The Egyptian gods got adopted by the Greek gods, became the Roman gods. They're all the same gods. A brilliant book written by Gene Wolfe, who passed away recently, called Soldier of the Mist, said something very true in there. There are not as many gods as you think. They're all the same people. The Greek gods and the Roman gods are exactly the same gods. They just changed the name slightly. From Zeus it became Jupiter. The Aphrodite became Venus, and these are. And notice that Jupiter, Venus, these are planets. So the constellations, the stars, the gods always come from the sky. So we have that through, and we in completely remote cultures that never met. So the Egyptians have this sort of idea. The Aztecs and the Mayans had this idea, to the nth degree. Pizarro, right? Pizarro drew a line in the sand with his sword. That's where the saying line in the sand comes from. He drew a line in the sand with his sword and said, "Who's with me? And we're going to conquer this continent." And 13 men stepped over that line. Pizarro conquered pretty much a continent with 13 men. How did he do that? Well, because he was white, and some of the guys that were with him had, blonde beards and blue eyes, despite the fact that, the Moors had been in Spain for like 700 years before they got kicked out of the Reconquista, which took another couple hundred years. So, most Spaniards are not exactly Teutonic members of the, they don't have blonde hair, blue eyes, but some of them did. And the Aztecs had this, the kings, Atahualpa and so on, these guys weren't considered kings. They didn't even call themselves kings. They called themselves stewards. They were holding the seat for the kings, for the gods who would come back. And the gods had a white skin and could fly in the sky and so on. And that's why, the Spaniards also, they had steel shot, and they used the various wars that were going on between the various Indian tribes to help them defeat the Aztecs and the Mayas and so on. But the fact is that they were considered the gods come back to get their place to quite a big extent. In the Mahabharata of the Hindus, you've got descriptions of missiles that explode like 10,000 suns. You've got descriptions of novas, which the first nova was only observed in 1950s. How did they know about that stuff, thousands of years ago? The Mahabharata says supposedly these are stories that were like passed down verbally over 30,000 years. And 30,000 years is a very interesting period. 30,000 years ago is when the fossil record of the human race gets very interesting. Neanderthal man got taken out by Homo sapiens and so on. You've also got huge pyramids on Earth, and you have pyramids on Mars. And the weird thing is, we can't build those pyramids now. So Dan, if you want to make another video about how we can build a great pyramid today, good luck, because that's one of the things I covered here too. We cannot build the Great Pyramid today. I've worked in construction for now nearly 33 years I've been in construction. We can't build the Great Pyramid today. Okay, with the technology we have, we cannot achieve the building of that structure. And if you think that the Great Pyramid is the biggest pyramid on Earth, you're wrong. Because in China, there is what they call the White Pyramid. It's now in a military zone, you can't get access to it. There's other pyramids next to it. But now the White Pyramid is a huge thing, which the Chinese government doesn't let people go and see, and they've started trying to, they were growing trees on it about 20 years ago, so it probably looks like a hill now. They were trying to hide it because they think it was the burial place of one of their ancient emperors. The White Pyramid starts to look like one of the Martian pyramids, which are huge. But keep in mind that Mars also has a much lower gravity than Earth, so you could build bigger pyramids easier. And you've got these great pyramids, you know, you've got the pyramids in the Aztecs culture, in the Mayan culture, in the Egyptian culture, in the Chinese culture. It seems everywhere on Earth had pyramids, and we still haven't quite figured out how the hell they built these things. Now, the later pyramids, you know, the degraded forms of pyramids, yeah, we have some evidence of how those were built. But the big ones, the ones that are like, who the hell did this and when did they do it? We don't know. We literally don't know. And there is one more piece of smoking. You know, even in Genesis, you've got these like, you know, Sodom and Gomorrah got wiped out by fire from the sky. So, you know, these guys are still, in my opinion, around knocking the crap out of each other and still carrying on the war that they had on Mars. Whichever people survived the Martian War came to Earth and became the gods. There is also another planet that probably used to exist between Mars and Jupiter, where we now have an asteroid belt. So this war was pretty big. If that planet was, and I'm not hanging my hat on this, but if there was a planet between Mars and Jupiter and it became rubble, and then Mars got destroyed intelligently by asteroid impacts, it's pretty likely that, you know, there was a pretty big war going on there. And then even some places on Earth got wiped out by little asteroids like Sodom and Gomorrah, which, by the way, that's been investigated now, and that is what happened. That's what destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, an asteroid impact. And look at the description of that story, right? The two angels that come there, they've got these like weird staffs that blind people, you know, it's quite weird, these angels. Yeah. And again, in the Hindu stories, you've got the description of these weapons of war, these steel arrows that blow up with the power of 10,000 suns, atom bombs, and people start to die, their hair falling out, their teeth falling out, and the only way that they can sort of protect themselves is by washing themselves with water. And again, that looks like radioactive poisoning. There's weapons described there that seem to be lasers that blind people. So there's quite a lot of circumstantial evidence that there used to be an advanced civilization that had a war, and the few survivors came to Earth, became the gods, and so on. There's also other stuff, you know. I personally have met with people like John Anthony West, who have discovered that there is a large chamber under the Sphinx which probably has metal in it, and he did this with seismograph tests, and we still don't know what's under because Zawi Hawass, or as I like to call him, Zawi Hawass, who's in charge of the you know, Egyptian area where the pyramids and everything is, has blocked it off and bricked it up and hasn't allowed anybody to go in it. So there is a lot of weird stuff going on. And then just one last thing about conspiracy theorists. Remember that the history of Earth, the history of the human race, is a long process of conspiracy after conspiracy after conspiracy. The linear theory of history doesn't make any sense. And it's conspiracy after conspiracy that creates the history that, you know, you think you know is not really correct. But you know, we'll leave that for another one. And you know what, Dan, you're a nice guy, so I'm gonna try and refrain from making a video, because I saw on your t-shirt there that you said that global warming is real. I'm gonna try and refrain from making a video about that because you're a nice guy. But there's a couple of other things on your t-shirt that we might have to get into. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the video. It's a bit longer than the ones Dan makes, but that's because I don't know how to do all the editing stuff. And I hope it responds, and I look forward to it. I'm sure it'll be a quite amusing response, whichever way it goes. And then I'm in London, so, you know, if you ever want to get together for a drink or whatever, you know, it's nicer than shooting each other or stabbing each other with swords. That would be pretty cool. Okay, hope you enjoyed it.